Yeah, so there has been huge changes in this industry with the publication of the two Australian standards, of which I was a committee member, and the Code of Practice by Safe Work Australia was published in March this year, and that is massive for our industry. So what I did is I asked three other experts to join me on a panel to discuss what the ramifications this has on the restoration industry, both for IEPs and for mould remediators. So it relates to both industries. And what I thought was going to be an hour lecture ended up being 3 hours. So this is the first hour of that discussion on what the legislation is, from an IEP and from a mould remediation perspective. So it's been pre-recorded. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Can I share my screen, please? Cal?
Yes. Yep, done. Thanks.
Delete. And let me open this up.
I'm very excited to be presenting this lecture with a preview on work health and safety legislation and the...
Here we go. Just got to get it bigger. I've got to... Sorry, guys, take two. Let me get back to the Zoom session. And I'll start it from scratch.
Obligate.
Here we go. Okay, let's start from scratch. So here is the discussion with Sam Ruff, Michael McKenzie and Brian Jepson, who will introduce themselves. And the first part of this, which will only cover an hour tonight, is the legislation relating to the restoration industry.
I'm very excited to be presenting this lecture with a preview on work health and safety legislation and the obligations for people in the restoration industry to comply. We've had these discussions over quite some time, all four of us, about where work health and safety legislation applies to restoration. And I think that's really come to the surface now with the publication of the two Australian standards and the Code of Practicing for Managing Biological Hazards, which was recently published in March this year. So what we're going to go through is what the legislation is actually saying and how it could apply in the restoration industry, and really the urgency for people who are testing and remediating water damaged buildings. The awareness of this is very, very important as part of running a business. So let's get started. So work health and safety risk management. This lecture is specifically for builders, restorers, remediators, and of course IEPs. Now, before we get started, Sam, can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Sam Ruff. I'm the Managing Director of CERTS, a restoration company. I'm an IRCRC Triple Master. I'm also the Restoration Industry Association of Australasia's Advocacy and Mentorship Chairperson.
Yes, and you spent an enormous amount of time, looking at the importance of education in the restoration industry, and of course the hopefully soon the Cert 4 in cleaning and restoration.
Yes, so Cert 4 has been a large undertaking. We're still working through it, but the IRCRC is committed to trying to get it off the ground. Hopefully sometime in the next 12 months we should see an RTO developed.
Fantastic. And I'd imagine a lot of the information we're about to present will be an important part of that knowledge skill set.
100%. I think one of the most important things about the Cert 4 is that it will incorporate much more Australian-specific information, specifically around WHS. And the Cert 4 is developed now with specific WHS modules in it.
That's really good to hear. Brian, can you give us a background on yourself, please?
I've been in the game for a little while now, especially around the restoration industry. Nearly 15 years, I would say, coming close to. And I have studied the basics of occupational hygiene. I'm a qualified building biologist, a vocationally educated, trained indoor environmental professional, and also hold certified microbial consultant designation with ACAC, and I've also studied with the ICRC to get my AMRT, and so that's applied microbial technician and fire and smoke restoration technician as well. Qualified plumber, not licensed, so don't ask me to install your toilets because I will not. I've also learned at Macquarie Institute of Research to do advanced fungal spore identification, and have two businesses that I have: Keystone Environmental, doing environmental consultancies, and also Oceanic Laboratory Initiative for environmental analysis. I currently sit as the president for the Indoor Air Quality Association for Australia, and I also lecture at the Australian College of Environmental Studies, or ACES, our friend.
Yes, you do. I think you took up half the entire lecture with all your qualifications. Thank you for
My
that.
bad.
Michael.
Good evening. Michael McKenzie. I'm the owner of Hadshaw. We're an occupational hygiene and hazardous materials company. We specialise in the management of environmental hazards, not just in the hazardous materials, but extends into the broader occupational hygiene. So it's the fundamentals of the basics of what we're trying to achieve. Hadshaw owns and operates non-accredited laboratories, which included mould and mould on surface analysis. We've been operating for 18 years this year, so we're quite familiar with what the workplace health and safety regs call.
Yes, and I think you're probably one of the largest hygiene companies in Queensland, I'd imagine.
Close to, yeah.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I'm very excited to have you all on board. As I said, we've had this discussion over the last few years about, how to implement the requirements under the work health and safety legislation into the restoration industry. So let's get started. So the Code of Practice has now officially designated that mould is a biological hazard, and under the work health and safety legislation, mould in water damaged buildings is a biological hazard. So all work health and safety duties will apply to anyone dealing with water damaged buildings, including builders, restorers, remediators, IEPs, and other duty holders. Now we're going to explain and list who those duty holders are. I think people are going to be quite surprised who is involved with that. So why this is really important, the restoration industry definitely needs a formal risk management system, and under the work health and safety legislation, it's not just a drying or technical task, it is a health and safety activity with legal consequences, and those consequences can be quite severe if they're not adhered to. Given that mould is a biological hazard, we know that, but now of course it's in writing, thankfully. Uncontrolled spread of contamination or exposure of others can trigger the work health and safety liability well beyond the immediate work crew. Failure to comply can lead to provisional improvement notice, fines, and even industrial manslaughter. So I think most people have no understanding of the ramifications of this. And as we mentioned, builders, restorers, remediators, anyone involved in water damaged buildings must undertake a risk management process. They need to consult, cooperate, and coordinate with multiple parties, and they have to document the process and any deviations from the standard care. So we're going to talk about what that risk management process looks like, the documentation, some ideas on what those documents should look like. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. Primary focus is to make people aware of what the legislation is saying and then provide examples of how we would comply. So by the end of the lecture, to bring to awareness the legislation relevant to water damaged buildings, distinguish the legislation, and of course we have work health and safety, building regs, tenancy regulations, code of practice, and of course the Australian standards, S500, S520. How to apply the risk management and hierarchy of control to mould related work, and recognise when documentation, consultation, and independent verification are required. Just having an understanding of how to apply the legislation and describing these obligations when scoping a remediation project. So this is going to relate to IEPs as well as remediators and everyone involved. So the legislation, what we'll cover is 3 parts. Legislation, including work health and safety, code of practice, Australian standards, building and tenancy. We're not going to go into too much detail on the last 2. Risk management, what that looks like under the work health and safety legislation. So the importance of identifying the hazard, assessing and controlling the risk and monitoring it. And case studies as examples of how this could be applied. Okay, so resources. I think what's really important going through this is we're really encouraging people to actually get these documents and read them so they understand what their obligations are under the legislation. Very exciting to see the code of practice that was published in March, and I believe the Restoration Industry Association and specifically you, Sam, spent quite a bit of time providing a submission to this, which thankfully got the restoration industry in writing, which is fantastic to see.
Well, we did. We put 32 recommendations forward, and all of them got recognised in some way or another. 7 were fully adopted, 12 partially, 13 in principle, and specifically mould and water damage buildings, HEPA filtration, and listing restoration and remediation workers as an occupation at high risk. So we're very proud of that success there.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Really good for the industry. And of course, Brian, you and I were on the committee for the Australian standards that were adopted, the S500 and the S520. We did want to make some extra changes, but
Sam was the brains.
oh, Sam was there too. Oh, Sam, how could I have missed you? I think you were on the recording because you didn't actually come at the time. Were you on the screen, or did you actually come to the meeting in Melbourne?
No. I was the lead. I was in Melbourne. I was the lead drafter, but to them eventually, yeah.
There we go. Fantastic. Great. All right. So let's start with the legislation. Just to revise, under the legal framework, an act and regulations are legally enforceable. The code of practice is not legally enforceable, but does guide compliance and provides more specific instructions on how to comply with the act and the regs. The Australian standards define competent technical practice in the restoration and remediation industries. So under the obligations, you must do all that you're reasonably able to manage the risks of biological hazards to workers and other persons at the workplace, including vulnerable people who we will define where the person has disclosed those needs according to the code of practice. So let's start with the Work Health and Safety Act. Now, I know, Michael, you've been onto the Work Health and Safety Act for many, many years as an occupational hygienist. So did you want to go through, what this entails?
I guess the act and the reg, obviously the legal framework that we need to work under as PCs, as principal contractors, but also as PCBUs, so as people that are conducting a business or undertaking. All the information that's been provided today, especially around the Act and the regs, has been in the regs since 2011. And we just got to sort of reiterate that none of this stuff is so that the codes of practice that are being released aren't actually new information. It's an expansion of all the information that's been sitting in the reg for some time. So the code of practice that's been released it gives you a lot more information than the high level stuff. To give you some more examples, but this has been around since 2011, and that's something that we need to just reiterate, that this is not new. It might be new because we've got some codes of practice, but the basis of all this information has been around for quite some time.
Yeah, so the Act of Parliament provides a primary duty of care and requires the provision and maintenance of work environment without risks to health and safety. Failure to comply, as we mentioned, can result in imprisonment up to 25 years and even fines of up to $20 million when you look specifically at the Work Health and Safety Act New South Wales. So just to give an idea, the Work Health and Safety Act is the responsibility of each state and territory. However, most jurisdictions do follow the Model Work Health and Safety Act that was developed by Safe Work Australia in 2011, which you mentioned. So you can see here who the regulator is, what the Work Health and Safety Act is. Most follow except Victoria, which has the old Work Health and Safety Act of 2004 and regulated by WorkSafe Victoria. So Victoria is a bit sort of standalone compared to the other states and territories, which really are very similar to what Safe Work Australia had developed in 2011. Western Australia, of course, was the latest to come on board in 2020. If we give an example of what the guts of the Work Health and Safety Act is saying, as a primary duty of care that relates to people in the industry is, as you mentioned, Michael, a person conducting a business or undertaking is a PCBU, must ensure, and this is where they argue, as so far as reasonably practicable, and I'm sure lawyers can argue that to kingdom come in a court scenario, the health and safety of workers, the health and safety of other persons is not put at risk. So this could include, obviously occupants in the building, or other, people that are employed, the provision and maintenance of a work environment without risk to health and safety, and the health of workers and conditions at the workplace are monitored for the purpose of preventing illness or injury arising from the conduct of the business or undertaking. This is a really interesting one, because I think about, when I'm going in and testing water damaged buildings, lifting up carpets, knowing that the spore counts are going to dramatically increase just by lifting up carpets to look at the smooth edge, or can increase that spore count quite considerably, and thinking about the ramifications and what that may have on the occupants after you've left the building. So there's definitely a lot of areas where we need to start thinking about our actions and what that actually does. Now, duty holders have legal duties to ensure health and safety. And just to give an example, Sam, did you want to go into this? Because you did give me quite a bit of information on this initially. So if we're looking at here at some of the duty holders that are defined in the Act.
Yeah, so I think what this has really done, especially the code of practice reinforcing it, but as Michael said, it's not new, is emphasize the breadth of the duty holders that exist in these situations. So the PCBUs could be company directors, but it's not just, say, the restoration company or the IAP company. It could be the building company. It could be the property management company, the strata company, which I think you're going into later. But it has really emphasized that the audit trail now, I suppose, has that's expected from all of those PCBUs it exists in that code of practice. I was just thinking, yeah, sorry, Nicole, if you want to keep going with that.
Yeah, so they define the PCBUs, which would define officers, as you mentioned, company directors, business owners, but also the workers have a duty of care to take reasonable care for their own health and safety, not adversely affect others, follow instructions, use PPE. Even subcontractors and consultants are included here, people who are managing or controlling the workplace, even manufacturers, importers, suppliers. Failure to comply may result in prosecution. So there are many duty holders that go beyond, I think, what most people would imagine. With the Work Health and Safety Act, a notifiable incident under Section 35 to 38 means that you have to notify the regulator in your state if somebody dies as a result of the work that's conducted, if there's a serious injury or illness, which is a challenge, isn't it? Because with mould illness, it can often be delayed. It can be an allergic response that happens hours or days later. Could be the recurrent respiratory tract infections or pneumonia down the track. But this is an interesting one, isn't it, in terms of how they define this as requiring immediate treatment as an inpatient in a hospital, or requiring medical treatment within 48 hours. So that's definitely...
To also add something there as well, sorry, is to understand what is actually a workplace, and where the Act and the reg actually affects, or where the reg and the Act is enforceable, and technically everywhere is a workplace. In high level summary, is that everywhere is a workplace if you're getting paid to do a thing there. So if you're getting paid to replace a light bulb, that's your particular workplace. It might be in someone's house, but that's your particular workplace that you've been engaged to do something. So you, under the reg and under the act and under all the safety documents, you need to assess your risks to conduct your work. That's just something that we need to remind everybody that a house, if you're getting paid to do work inside of that house, that is your workplace. So as you said, pulling up a corner of the carpet to see whether there's mold under the carpet on the smooth edge. Well, you need to take control of your risks. So do you need to put a mask on? Do you need to isolate that area away so you're not affecting other people and you're not creating additional hazards that are going to affect yourself and others?
That's a really good point, because I think a lot of people assume that a house is not part of a workplace. I know when I did the grade dip in health and safety 25 years ago, if someone came to chop down trees at my place and they fell off, they could sue me, because did I ask about what was their work health and safety with their insurance, in terms of their risk management, etc. So, there've been certainly many cases at VCAT, NCAT where that has happened. So that's really good. Thanks for confirming that. The workplace is when somebody goes and is being paid or doing, a workplace activity in another position, and that can include a house. Did anyone else want to comment on that at all?
I think for restorers also, it's not just the job site. The van, the vehicle that you're transporting, say, the mold affected material you remove from the house, you've got to, obviously, you're supposed to bag it up, store it the right way on site to transport it, but also ensuring the integrity of that container, I suppose, when you're transporting it, because that van can become a contaminated site. And you can track that contamination back to others outside of the immediate workplace, including your own family.
Yes, great. Good point. Consultation is mandatory. I really love this about the Work Health and Safety Act, which I don't really believe has happened very well in the industry at all. Like, having had a recent escape of liquid at my place, the builders come to do the scope, but it's a mold problem. Like, I don't get that. And then the mold remediators come in, but they haven't talked to the builder. Like, no one, left and right arm, have no idea what they're doing, and everyone's gathering data separately instead of consulting, which is required under the Work Health and Safety legislation. So consultation.
Communications.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nicole. Communication is a big problem, specifically in the insurance space. Restoration, remediation, it's predominantly focused in the insurance space. A lot of the damage that we attend is an insurable event. And there are multiple trades or supply partners that are engaged by the insurers. And even though they're working towards improving it, there is still fairly limited ability for those trades or businesses to communicate among each other. They get allocated to the site or the claim independently from the insurer, and often don't know. We often don't know who the builder is. We don't know what the previous person has done. We may set up containment as a restorer. The builder sends another subcontractor out there, the plumber, the electrician, and they will breach the containment and probably not put it back together either properly. Following the right protocols, when you look at the chain and the expanse of the responsibilities and who has a duty under the Act, communication is where the failure is probably greatest.
Absolutely. So if you share the site, you share the duty to coordinate risk control according to Safe Work Australia, the Code of Practice. All right, so here's a case study of a strata title apartment with Cat 2 water from an upstairs leak. Who is the person conducting a business? Well, I think people will be quite shocked. It's all of the following, right? The body corporate owners, strata or building manager, owner of the upstairs unit, could be a PCBU, depending on whether the unit is rented out as a business. Like, who would have thought? Property manager, plumber, restoration company, IEP, builder, waterproofer, tenant, employer. So here there's quite a lot of people that are involved that should be talking to one another, right, under the Work Health and Safety legislation. So ideally, in the ideal scenario, A single coordinated risk plan with named responsibilities and a sequencing schedule is the practical answer. Without coordination, each PCBU compliance depends on the others, and a failure by one creates exposure for all. Now, that's pretty strong. And definitely something that's not really happening very well in the industry. So let's have a quick look at the work health and safety regulations. Again, like the Act, the regulations are state and territory specifically. However, they have adopted the work health and safety regulations developed by Safe Work Australia, except of course Victoria. So you can see here the years. Again, WA recently came on board in 2022, but most of the other states have followed Safe Work Australia's guidelines for quite some time. Just looking at the regulations that could relate to the restoration industry, if we're looking here at the Federal Register under Part 3.2, Division 7, Section 50, monitoring. I'm going to talk a bit about this because there's a lot of confusion about when do you get an IEP involved, when do you need to monitor, when is it okay not to monitor is really important because, of course, monitoring airborne fungal particulate is expensive because of the lag involvement. And, you know, knowing when to do it, when not to do it can be really important to establish condition 2, for example, but it may not be warranted, of course, if there's extensive contamination. So under the regulations, monitoring is necessary to determine whether there is a risk to health. So here we've got this vulnerable population again. A person conducting a business must ensure that the results of air monitoring carried out under sub-regulation 1 are recorded and kept for 30 years. I'm sure most people don't know that. Under the definitions in the regulations, airborne contaminant means many things, but it also includes microorganisms. And I think we can definitely say quite confidently that mould would definitely fit under that category. Michael, did you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, we work in this part of the reg quite a bit in the broader occupational hygiene. Is you know, especially in the restoration industry, we've got to consider that mold is one contaminant, but there are a number of other contaminants that you guys as remediators and also IEPs going into these locations after or during the middle of a remediation, the other hazards that need to be recognised and dealt with. You know, that can be anything from asbestos. You know, if we're dealing with some of the old buildings in flood areas, dealing with silica, you know, RCS, respirable crystalline silica. Yeah, they all have, you know, liability-wise, they've got huge liabilities. That if you're not managing those other hazards as well, you're certainly opening yourself up to a lot of risk, liability-wise, when it comes to you controlling a workplace, but then also your workers as well and how they're managing those. So it's understanding that Section 50 of the reg is talking about airborne contaminants. There's a document called the Airborne Contaminants document. There's obviously bigger words than that, but there are over 20, 30 pages of different contaminants that as a PCBU, you actually need to understand and consider those, not necessarily monitor them and keep an eye on those, but you have to consider those and you have to go through the process to determine whether those other risks are present. And if they are recognised to be present, you need to put in certain controls in order to manage that. Airborne monitoring or monitoring for those hazards is one part of the controls. It's not the only control. Well, I know we'll probably go speak about the hierarchy of control later on in the presentation, but it's understanding that monitoring isn't the control. Monitoring is the indicator to then determine what level of control you need to put in place.
Yeah, and of course, you know, any use of chemicals, biocides, etc., will justify the importance of having safety data sheets and having understanding of first aid procedures. And we'll go through that. Thank you for that. So yeah, airborne monitoring for mould is not automatically required under the work health and safety regulations, given there's no workplace exposure standard or limit, I think they're referring to now or shortly, for mould by aerosols. And this is part of the issue is feel like we're flying blind, haven't had a lot of really good foundational information for the industry. I'm sure most people in the industry want to do the right thing, but haven't really had a lot of, apart from the IICRC 5-day training, AMRT and WIT course, and of course at the college providing training in mould testing, there really hasn't been a lot of good information to enable people to understand what their obligations are, which of course is why what we're doing now.
Can
So
I
when
interject just for a sec? On this workplace exposure or even personal exposure, I think we need to clarify the difference here, where personal monitoring requires it to be worn by the person for an 8-hour period or equivalent for, and within the breathing zone. Typically, in our scenarios, when we're going in for the remediation side of things, there aren't anybody in those zones outside of the workers that are doing the remediation who could potentially be monitored. But if we are there to check the completion upon those remediation protocols, that's an environmental grab. Like that's a grab sample at a particular time to evaluate if there is an ongoing risk or if the controls have been successful. So when it comes to the monitoring, I just wanted to clarify that there are two different ways. So as much as we don't have exposure standards for personal exposure standards, because that'll be very complicated and probably unethical to do any studies for, moving forward, I don't know how they might do that, but we do have the ability and we do have a lot of guidelines and clarifications when it comes to environmental thresholds that we look at that may be of elevated risk or atypical presentations in the environment. So we do have those, but we don't have it for personal.
Great, glad you differentiate that.
And as well, like with Brian's comment is with the that we don't have an exposure standard for mold. People, what we don't want to have is a reason, have that as the reason why not to do air monitoring.
The baby out with the bathwater idea.
That's right. And so it's just because we don't have exposure standards for mold or sort of what is acceptable levels, it doesn't mean that then that's now an excuse not to monitor. When you speak to the regulator and if the regulator gets involved in a complaint process and that someone's being claiming that they've been exposed in this situation to mold, they will have a look and sort of say, well, have you actually grabbed any information to determine whether there is an exposure or a risk or a hazard in that workplace? And so if they got presented with two reports, one that has monitoring and one that doesn't have monitoring, well, they're going to really give a lot more weight to the report and the document that does have monitoring, because what you've done is actually shown some initiative that you've considered those risks. You've gone down the pathway of understanding what you're actually dealing with. If you have a report that they says, no, don't worry about it, everything will be right, well, they'll tend to sort of go, well, you haven't gone through that process. You've just eliminated it because you've made an excuse because it fits in your narrative or whatever it might be to help you for that particular job.
Yeah, I think the other thing that this really highlights for restorers is that we are we're very much focused on our restoration and remediation standards, the S500, the S520, and the verbiage that's in those when it comes to, say, engaging an IEP. Brian said earlier that there's often with the majority of these situations, there's no one home. It's actually probably the opposite when you're doing insurance claims for water damage and mold. Probably the majority of the time, as restorers, there's still people occupying the property. If their claim is complex, there's vulnerable occupants, or there's risk as defined by the standard, significant risk, and the IEPs that involved, then yes, they're often not present, as Brian said. But I think the main point is that restorers need to look at the WHS legislation and code of practice as well as their industry standards, because
Over and above, yeah.
Over and above the industry's legislation, the Australian legislation and code of practice needs to take precedent over when it comes to risk and WHS, obviously over the S500 and S520. And just because, say, under the S520, the restorer deems that the risk isn't significant enough to engage an IEP, doesn't mean that controls and other measures are required, such as air monitoring, to determine the risk or monitor the risk. And the standard also doesn't talk, the S520 doesn't talk about air monitoring from a person or site risk point of view, because it's not a WHS standard. So yeah, I think it's really important for restorers to consider the WHS requirements in their state and let that take precedent over the standards they're working to.
Because that's included in the standard, right? It says refer to your local jurisdictions and whatever have you.
It
right?
does.
Because those can supersede in some fashions the application for the standard.
100%. I just think restorers are often so focused on the technical requirements of the standard and risk when it comes to whether or not to engage an IEP, that they may fall short of considering their worker risk or occupant risk outside of that under Australian-based legislation.
That's right. And then also the monitoring, being an environmental monitoring still gives you an understanding of what the hazard is that you're dealing with and what level of that hazard you're dealing with. So is the airborne environment at a point where a P2 mask or a P2 respirator is not actually going to be sufficient? You might have to go to a P3 positive pressure, so a PAPR positive pressure sort of mask, or in some really high risk areas is a breathing apparatus. So this is what your air monitoring also gives you, is to understand you as the restorer or the IEP to sort of go, well, maybe the mask or the respirator that I'm wearing on a day-to-day thing might not be suited for this particular thing. So it's understanding that air monitoring isn't just a political sort of push around trying to get more data. It's a full assessment of risk for not
Risk assessment
for the occupants, but then also the people that are dealing with it.
Yeah, and I think restorers are often basing the PPE decisions and even containment decisions in some cases on, say, the square meterage or the size of the visible growth. I think it's important that and air monitoring is the only way where we're going to be able to sort of, well, not the only way, but it's one of the main ways that's probably absent from restoration work to determine the respiratory risk or the inhalation risk. I think it was CO that spoke about that. That's referenced actually in the S520. So it gives us data that we can't get from visible inspection. Just because it's only a small amount of mould doesn't mean that it's that the airborne fungal particulate is low or the risk is low.
Yeah, and look, that's certainly been my experience, given that I've only dealt with private clients for the last 15 years, that some of the worst times I cannot see during even a thorough visual inspection. There's no odour, there's no visible mould, etc. But the fungal particulate in the air and the surface samples were extreme, and it correlates with the exposure history of adverse health effects. So I think we're starting to realise that, just a thorough inspection of looking at visible mould, odour, etc., and signs of moisture and elevated material isn't just sufficient, because it could miss, it's not quantifying the fungal particulate. And there's certainly pros and cons for monitoring in terms of short, just getting a static shot, but it does help assess the risk, which you've mentioned, which we're going to get to. So when monitoring is required, so under the Work Health and Safety regs, it's warranted when the PCBU can't determine on reasonable grounds whether airborne concentrations, like the extent or significant amount of contamination, may present a risk to health. And that's why I think it's really important, especially if there are vulnerable populations in that environment. And the reality that you can't see condition 2 on a visual inspection, ultimately, based on the IICRC S520, condition 2 and 3 surfaces need to be remediated. US EPA, in contrast, look at the area of mould in terms of whether remediation is required, but the S520 is very specific that, condition 2 and 3 surfaces, high settled spores, etc., and microbial growth should be remediated. And the only way to establish that is, in this case, is sampling. Now, there are times when monitoring, so we'll look at when it should be considered, when it's not required. So identifying condition 2 contamination, if you suspect there's hidden or inaccessible contamination within cavities, HVAC systems, where the inspection is incomplete, occupant or worker complaints, if there's respiratory issues or odours or recurrent dampness, which indicate possible ongoing airborne exposure pathway. If there are vulnerable persons, which will define who they are, where they may be exposed, if disturbances during demolition, stripping, cleaning, where you may be exposed to much higher levels as a result of disturbing fungal particulate on surfaces. Post-remediation uncertainty, where visible mould growth has been removed, but there's still doubt about whether there's airborne contamination. So airborne monitoring is often not necessary where the hazard is already obvious and the required controls are clear. So it's so that's when it should be considered. And I thought I had a slide where it shouldn't be considered, but essentially, if it's extensive and it's obvious, then obviously airborne monitoring is not required. Or if there's an assumption that it already is contaminated, condition 2, for example, then monitoring may not be required. So safe work method statements is actually documented in the Work Health and Safety Regulation. And this is what applies to the restoration industry, that safe work method statements will be required if you're working in or near confined spaces, which of course many of us do, anything involving asbestos-containing material, involving demolition, especially the load-bearing structural element, where electrical installations or services are present, near a trench or shaft of more than 1.5 metres, work heights of more than 2 metres. So when a safe work method statement is required, do you want to go through this, Sam? Because you're going to need this information here, prepared before work starts. Yeah.
It definitely needs to, I think, so that you've got to put yourself in a position that what is it going to be defensible if you get audited, or if, say, safe work inspector turns up on site. And I think the common failures that we see are when it's the safe work method statements prepared after work's already commenced. The hazards and risk and controls aren't necessarily all included in the safe work method statement. It's not accessible on site. I mean, we have digitalisation these days, so there's really no excuse. It's not site specific. We all love a template, but we need to make sure that it's site specific. And if the scope changes or the situation changes, the risks changes, we need to update the safe work method statement. That's probably one of the most common things that doesn't happen. We use it. It's sort of a tick and flick approach. In many cases, the client requires the SWIMs as it is. We do what we need to do to get them that to tick the box so that we can start work or meet their requirements, but we forget about it after that. And there's restoration and remediation is full of variations. There's a lot of things that we don't know about and we can't foresee or see until we start the work and start removing building materials, etc. So as soon as the scope changes and the risk changes, we need to update the SWIMs. I think that's really important. Retention for the right period of time is another big thing. How many restorers actually know how long they're supposed to keep their safe work documentation or their WHS documentation? It varies, as we saw, and we will see more of, depending on what that documentation is.
So essentially, if it's missing or generic, that's an immediate compliance gap. Yeah.
It's probably the most common thing. We all have templates, but we don't modify them enough for the site-specific risks.
And that just comes back down to showing the regulator that you've considered. Like sometimes we're not all perfect. We're just humans. But if you've shown that you've gone out of your way to consider what you know and what you can, that's where 99% of the win is. If you've just black boxed it and you've just used the template and gone, here you go, and you just turned up to site, yeah, that's where the regulator will come down on you with a ton of bricks.
Yeah, so as Sam indicated here, generic SWIMs, same document for every job, not site specific, is where it will fail an audit, and not signed by workers because they've read it, but of course it's not signed, not updated when the scope needs to change, etc. Yeah. All right. Work Health and Safety Legislation map summary. So here's the Act and the regulation associated with each state and territory, the regulator as well. So depending on where you're working, you should be familiar who your regulator is and the Work Health and Safety Act and regulation in your state and territory. Code of Practice, Managing the Risks of Biological Hazards at Work, published in March this year, 2026. Interesting, from the 1st of July, Safe Work New South Wales requires persons conducting a business or undertaking have a duty to comply with an approved code of practice or use another method provided that the alternative delivers a standard of work health and safety that is equivalent to or higher than the standard required by the code. Does anyone want to comment about that?
I think I'll jump in really quickly and just say this is the start of more states adopting something like this. So if you think that, oh, it's okay, I'm not in New South Wales and therefore I'm not going to be held to such accounts, I think you'd be quite nearsighted. That's as quick as I'll jump in.
Yeah, look,
yeah.
Sorry, Sammy. The codes of practice are essentially the minimum standard that you should be accepting. And if it some degree is an element of legislation that you still need to comply with equal to or better than the code of practice. And Brian's right, so this is the start of a national adoption of a lot of codes of practice. We're seeing it with silica. In May 2022, the Queensland government created a management of silica in construction sites. Then of recent, there's now a national code of practice for managing silica. Queensland hasn't yet, and some other states haven't yet adopted that, but it is a yet. It's on the horizon. So as much as the reg, most of the states have adopted the reg in some similar degree, we're on the way to do that with codes of practice as well. Again, it's minimum standard. You got to be better than or equal to.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that even if there's no legislative or legislation implying a duty, whether it's a code of practice or it's a voluntary standard that isn't referenced in legislation, the question is asking yourself, have you done your due diligence, and what's it going to look like if you've been questioned about something and there's a code of practice that's applicable in your state, legislated or not, and you didn't follow it. Does that mean that the outcome is going to change from Safe Work's point of view? Probably not.
So how does this code apply to mould and dampness? Well, everyone needs a copy of this and they need to read it, obviously, but the Managing the Risks of Biological Hazards at Work is an approved code of practice under Section 274 of the Work Health and Safety Act and Regs. Under the Code of Practice, Safe Work Australia recognises mould as a biological hazard and damp and water damage buildings as environments that create airborne and material-based exposure risks for workers. It identifies contaminated materials, dust, water and air as sources of exposure, including water damaged buildings with mould growth. This means mould and dampness are not only building defects, they're also work health and safety, biological hazard issues that require risk management. So how are workers exposed in damp and mould affected buildings? Through the air, contaminated dust, water, air and airborne moulds. Duty holders to consider whether there is visible or suspected mould, inadequate ventilation and work involving mould contaminated building materials, where there's disturbance of wet or moulding materials during cleaning, which of course dramatically escalates during cleaning. Demolition or maintenance can definitely increase airborne risk. Health effects we'll go into, but essentially adverse respiratory tract infections, occupational asthma, pneumonitis, chronic bronchitis, etc. Under the Code of Practice, the duty holder, you can see what this means in mould work. I'm not going to read this step by step, but essentially there are obligations of PCBs, which we've already gone through, and workers and officers and other duty holders that they must comply under the Safe Work Australia. Then anyone want to comment on this table before we move on? No? Okay, so just summarising, the Act is generally quite vague, but employees shall provide and maintain a workplace that is safe and without risks to health. It essentially is what that means. So if there's any issue in terms of health, the health and safety of workers, then of course you have not complied with the Act. The regulations are more specific than the Act. Duty holders must identify hazards, assess risk, implement the hierarchy of control, and review those controls. That is mandatory, and the Code of Practice really now recognises water damaged buildings and mould as biological hazards, and it is admissible in court as evidence of what is reasonably practicable. Penalties can apply, as we've mentioned. So let's just briefly go through Australian standards, which were adopted last year in Australia. The S500 and S520 are technical standards. And as mentioned, this is what our industry, hopefully our industry has been following, not realising that when it came to work health and safety related practice and risk management, that it's really, the S520 isn't really providing that information. It's really providing the technicalities of doing your job as a restorer, as opposed to complying with work health and safety and risk management. It doesn't address or provide guidance to doing that, because of course it varies from country to country. So the S520, very briefly, standard of care for professional mould remediation to be followed. Physical removal and cleaning, sprays, fogging, fungicides and stain removers are not substitute for physical removal and remediation. Deviations from the standard of care and conflicts of interest must be disclosed in writing. It would be good to see this actually put in practice, especially now that this has been adopted as an Australian standard. And again, communication and documentation are very, very important. The S520 does not cover water damage restoration. That's the S500. It doesn't cover regulated hazardous materials, which must be addressed as part of our work. And it doesn't cover trauma scenes and clandestine drug laboratories. S500, we know, of course, it defines the standard of care for professional water damage restoration. And it'll be really good to see, you know, in the insurance-related industry, restorers given the time and the ability to do their job in a timely manner would be great. And I think it'd save a lot of money for insurance, you know, the amount of insurance premiums we're paying unnecessarily because remediators, restorers are not getting to be able to dry in a timely manner. And now it's become a mould job as opposed to just a drying job. We'll definitely have these discussions over quite some time. The S520 does not cover mould remediation. It doesn't cover HVAC remediation, which is required under the ANSI S590 in the ERA guidelines. Fire and smoke restoration, it doesn't cover either. So, as you said, Sam, the S500 and S520 is something that the industry has been, most people in the industry have done that training, hopefully are following that practice, but it doesn't provide the specifics on how to comply under the work health and safety legislation.
Correct. Yeah, I think it's important. Yeah, restorers understand their particular jurisdiction's WHS requirements.
Yeah. So disclosure under the S520, it states remediators and IEPs have a duty to protect occupants and clients through communication, documentation, and transparency. Provide enough information for clients and occupants to understand the plan and their risks and the limitations of the project. Explain the remediation process, the precautions to be taken, and the controls used to inform occupants about breaching containment, which I imagine is a common problem. Deviation from the standard of care should be specified in writing. I really like that. So the fact that it should be documented in writing, if they choose to fog over, say, for example, the HEPA sandwich, that should be documented in writing to all stakeholders involved. IEP, if an IEP is required and they're not independent from the remediator, that should be disclosed in writing to the client. Insurance.
Yeah, I think just to touch on that with the insurance space, Cole, we pretty much always have some kind of deviation from the standard purely due to policy coverage, but you rarely see a deviation or an LCCC listed in restoration reports applying to that, and technically they should be.
Insurance restorers and IEPs, according to the S520 in the forward, most mould remediation firms are not correctly insured and probably don't even know it. Now, we're not going to go into any specific details, but we've listed things here that they should have: public liability, professional indemnity, errors, emissions, Tell me a bit about the mold microbial liability. I hadn't heard of that before, Sam. Do you want to go into that?
You're just going to be very careful with all of this without going into specifics because it changes every year. Like we saw about 2023, the fogging or misting situation where it was extremely difficult to find public liability insurance that covered. It's generally referred to as misting because it's by the Australian insurers often seen as a pest control situation. Most insurers started excluding it, wouldn't provide coverage for it. So it is just, I think the thing to take away from this for restorers is go through your policy in detail, use a broker that knows your industry and that understands it and that can get you the broadest coverage possible and explain in detail what isn't covered. Because there's language restrictions in your reports, just like there is for IEPs, and there can be mold and microbial exclusions or limitations as such.
I would also, just as a professional courtesy, suggest to engage your broker pretty early before your policy is due, because like Sam said, they will chop and change, and your insurer will probably change every year. And your broker needs to find that out because it's a pain.
It seems, yeah, it is. And it seems to be a little bit easier at the moment, but following the Lismore floods, it was a 2 to 3 month process in 2023 to find public liability insurance that had appropriate coverage. Yeah.
Building legislation. I don't really want to go into too much detail here, but just to bring to people's attention, again, every state and territory has its own act and regulations, and I've also listed the authority here, so should be at least familiar with that legislation. And if I was to summarise it, the underlying construction performance of a new build or a renovated part of a building is that the roof and external wall of a habitable area within a dwelling should not have moisture that causes unhealthy or dangerous conditions, or loss of amenity, which means that room can't be used for its purpose, for occupants, and undue dampness or deterioration of building elements. That's in the building regs. The National Construction Code, for those who are not familiar with that, is a national performance-based technical code produced by the Australian Building Codes Board. It provides a guidance to builders and tradespersons on prevention of dampness. The builder's obligations is generally to construction work that includes renovation, repair, maintenance, refurbishment, or demolition. Moisture damage construction projects can trigger both building and work health and safety obligations. If work is high risk, safe work method statements or SWIMS obligations may apply before the work starts. Under the National Construction Code, in the different volumes, depending on the class, a building is including associated site work. I'm not going to go into details on this, but just to show that there are performance requirements and deemed to satisfy provisions that relate to mould and moisture in new builds and those undergoing renovations. I do want to highlight here, building surveyors have an incredible amount of power. I think most of them don't realise this. The power to declare a building unfit for occupation, and this is actually documented in several of the regulations in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland and WA. This could be an effective tool when a housing authority or landlord or rental provider won't engage. So restorers and IEPs could recommend the occupant or tenant request a building surveyor inspect. The challenge is a lot of the building surveyors don't have a good understanding of moisture and mould. So that's the challenge. They've got this power, but they don't often have the underpinning knowledge and skills to actually know how to actually assess that in a way that they could declare it as unfit for occupation. Did any of you want to comment about that?
No, I think you said it fine.
No, okay. So provide moisture mapping and data essentially to assist the building surveyor. Yep. Tenancy legislation, again, I'll just skip through this, but this is more for rental providers and renters, and it's something I think all restorers and IEP should have an awareness of in their state and territory. Again, it's state and territory specific, and the every state will have its own tribunal. So I've just listed what the Residential Tenancy Act and regulations are in each state. But if I was to summarise it, just lifting the Victoria regulations, the rental provider quite obviously needs to ensure the premises are fit to occupy, weatherproof and free from mould and damp due to the building structure, keep the property in good repair and fix defects, including leaks, water ingress and dampness, carry out urgent water-related repairs promptly, complete non-urgent repairs within a reasonable time, and disclose any repair notice received in the last 3 years related to mould or dampness. So there are obligations under the residential tenancy regulations for the rental provider, formerly referred to as the landlord. The renter occupant also has responsibility to notify the rental provider in writing as soon as leaks and water ingress occurs. Now, the challenge with this, with a housing crisis, is so many of my clients don't want to say anything because they've got nowhere else to move into. I mean, it's just ridiculous what's going on out there, that you've got people who obviously under the regulations are required to notify the building manager or rental provider. But the reality is, if they complain, then they often get kicked out, even though they have rights that don't seem to be endorsed when they go to VCAT or INCAT. Like, it's a mess from what I can see. Renter should report urgent water-related issues so they can be arranged. Not that sometimes they're acted on early. Most of the times, from my experience, they're not being acted upon in a timely manner. They must keep the premises reasonably clean and avoid causing damage that may contribute to dampness and mould. They should record and report any damp, mould, or repair issues in the condition report within 5 business days of moving in. Now, as we know, a lot of the time you can't see this, it's hidden, so this is a challenge. Take photos and note any unsafe conditions, moisture damage or mould in the condition report to support repair requests and allow access where proper entry procedures have been followed so repairs and inspections can occur.
Okay, so that was the first hour just on the legislation. The second half went for an hour and a half, and that was all about risk management. So how we actually understand the legislation and develop a risk management policy, what that would look like for IEPs. Now, this talk is both for restorers and for remediators and IEPs. So a lot of things like the swims will be much more specific for remediation and obviously in larger, commercial related work. However, I think Cal will need to do the risk management one at the next meeting so we can look at what that actually looks like. How do we implement risk management as IEPs? We do also include what the restorers need to do. So as a result of this and pulling this together with the other 3, I've spent the last 3 months looking and reviewing our templates and updating that for existing students coming through the course. They're about to go through the new lot in terms of making sure that they do consider these risk management policies, but also templates, obviously in the post-remediation course for insurance related work that would comply. So it's really starting. Sam and I are talking a lot more. He's one of the highest in the Restoration Industry Association, and as you know, they're looking at developing a Cert 4 in restoration, which will be good, and working together to go, okay, what templates do we actually need as IEPs and remediators to start working together? Because we're meant to under the work health and safety legislation, so that we're supporting one another. We understand the basic foundations of what you do, what we do, and that we work together so we have much better outcomes for all stakeholders. Because at the moment, the industry is extremely fractured and everyone's pretty much flying blind and doing their own individual thing. So we're really confident that over the next 5 years, this space will be very different. And as a result of, encouraging people to do national accreditation, whether it's through IEPs through the college or the restoration course, which the IRCRC look like they're going to come on board and offer a Cert 4 in restoration and remediation, which doesn't cover testing because that's what we do. So it's really exciting, a bit nerve-wracking. We're already doing a lot of great work, and a lot of your reports are already so very specific because you've identified at-risk populations. When in the second part, we'll look at the code. I strongly suggest everybody download it. It's free on Safe Work Australia, Code of Practicing for Managing Biological Hazards, and it actually lists at-risk populations, people with recurrent respiratory tract infections, asthma, kids. Like, you have to identify them, and if they're at risk, there's an argument that testing is really important. Now, I mentioned in the next session, we go into detail when is testing not required. And essentially it comes down to if a tree's fallen on the house, if they've had a cyclone or something through the house and it's so the whole house is impacted, you're not going to bother testing, right? If the remediator has assumed it's condition 2 without testing, that's justified. You don't need to test if you assume. My argument is that don't assess its condition 1 without testing. That's the point. And that's why the ASBB guidelines become really important. Don't make an assumption that it's not there. You can assume it is there, but you can't make an assumption it's not there without evidence. And I think that's where the ASBB guidelines are good. And ironically, perfect timing with this code, because at risk and risk management is a big part of this, which is identifying people who are at risk, and justifies why sampling is critical. You just cannot assess a house without sampling it because condition 2, you cannot see it. And many of us have been doing lots and lots of sampling, have seen time and time again things that don't look like they're obvious, where the clients are sick, there's water damage, and no visible mold, no odor, and you do the sampling and it's just extreme. Yeah. Excellent. So I hope we didn't bore you too much with that, the first session on legislation. It is good news for all of us because it's going to start shifting the industry to push them into compliance, like seatbelts. You force people to start wearing seatbelts, otherwise they get fined, they start doing the right thing. That's what's happening now in this industry, which is a good thing to do. So have a look at the Code of Practice, Work Health and Safety Act. It's a bit boring. I've teased out the most relevant bits, which is the duty of care. And next session in the ASBB, we'll look at risk management, how to actually assess risk.
Awesome.
When will that be?
When's our next session? A month away?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yep.
July.
Yeah.
Cole, can I just ask, when we're all talking about air monitoring, especially, the panel, is mold included? Will it be included for the next 5 years? Because when I look at some of the things that I see through labs and things, they focus on carbon dioxide but not mold.
Yeah, so what was interesting when Mike was talking about air monitoring, because you got the hazardous substance code of practice by Safe Work Australia, which we talk about in the sampling method subject, and there's lots and lots of chemicals. Not such an issue for us. It's the remediator. A remediator who chooses to fog or bring chemicals into the remediation process must have safety data sheets, must give those safety data sheets to consumers, and my argument is an IEP. I would want to know if I'm going to do a post-remediation verification and they've fogged a whole lot of chemicals like ozone, which is very dangerous. I should be notified of that as part of my risk management, and they have an obligation to assume that. So this is where, for chemicals, the remediator, it's on them for their risk management. Have they notified all stakeholders, including the occupants? Have they got safety data sheets? As an IEP, if you're doing post-remediation verification, your ATP doesn't work with some chemicals. So you find your ATP 0, which is not normal, because they've now fogged this chemical, which is modified and caused a false negative, and also increasing my risk of exposure to chemicals. So this is now, we can argue that where is the remediator's risk management process? If we're doing post-remediation, I want to know exactly what's been going on. We need to start talking more clearly so I can assess my risk or my workers' risk, etc. So it's more for them, but the big one for us will be asbestos. If it's an old house, if it's friable, old tiles still have white asbestos up until 2002 or so. If there's demolition involved, that has to be addressed because it's legislated. So if there's any asbestos that's friable, that has to be addressed before we even go in, before anyone remediates. That has the highest priority in the risk management process. And that's something that one should be mindful of, that we would not engage until that's actually been identified and or removed. So it's not a risk for us and other stakeholders going in. So we talk a bit about that in the risk management process. But airborne monitoring, really for me, when they were talking about it for 30 years, the reason why it's 30 years is because asbestos has such a long latency period. So that's why the Work Health and Safety Reg went into that detail for 30 years, because it's a 30-odd year latency period by the time people are exposed to asbestos to the time they get asbestosis or mesothelioma. They didn't quantify. Yeah.
Sorry, Carl. I wanted to ask you, did anyone quantify what monitoring is when they say monitoring the air? Because I already took on Woolies up here and NT WorkSafe because they said they are monitoring it. And I asked them, well, where are the records? And they said, no, we monitor it. We look at it. You know, they look at it every day. That's monitoring. It's like, that's not, and they go, you're
That's not
confusing measuring.
Yeah.
And I go, good point. What is monitoring? Because we're assuming it's sampling of some description.
Can't be, because
And
Well, it
yet
says in the
Woolworths
regs,
told me,
airborne monitoring, yes.
Mm.
Yeah, and as Brian rightfully said, when you're doing airborne monitoring from work health and safety, you're doing it within the space. So you're doing pumps, you're working with the work health and safety standards. And that's why I said in that part of the talk, we don't have workplace health and safety limits for mould, right? We only have our ASBB guidelines for vulnerable populations in residential environments. Work health and safety doesn't have a limit for mould. So that's the challenge. Where do we fit in? So the challenges has been people didn't understand what a workplace is. As soon as someone's paid to come into someone's built environment, that's a workplace. So we all work in workplaces. So that's number one. So therefore, work health and safety legislation applies to all of us. But understanding that airborne contaminant includes a microbe in the legislation. Now the challenge is assessing the risk. So you can argue that you're assessing the risk. The only way you can assess your risk actually is to do sampling. So if you're sampling and assuming it's condition 1, you are not doing your job. And you're not doing the client by the right thing, which I learned the hard way. Many of my old building biologists learned. You cannot go in and say, hey, this house is, just on a visual, this is fine. You're not doing your job and you're not assessing the risk and you're not complying with the work health and safety legislation. Because we all know condition 2 you can't see. So it is really good for us understanding this. Rewatch the video a few times, especially when we get to risk management, to show that you're assessing risk under the legislation, because nobody in the industry, I think, does this very well, except I think we do it better because we are always asking questions to the client. We're even identifying at-risk populations. No one in the insurance industry has been doing that, even asking or engaging the occupants. So assessing risk is the big blind spot. This is where all the problems are going to happen. But I think we already do this well. We've just got to put it in a bit of a nicer, neater package in terms of the work that we're doing to ensure that we're complying. And that's the templates we're creating at the moment.
Perfect. Does anyone have any questions about that? No? Nothing? All right. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thanks, Cole, for sharing that with us. Looking forward to next month. I love us. We always have so many more questions when we hear things.
Do we
And
have
that's the whole
links?
thing.
Do we
Sorry,
have
Jen?
links to? Do we have any links to any of the codes of practice? Or I know we've got the Safe Work Australia one, but do we have the other one, a code of practice on our website? The link at least, or
We'll get that up, James.
No, we
James,
don't. Yeah, but we can get that up. Yeah.
yeah,
that'd be great. Thank you.
100%. Look at it, watch over the video again. Exciting times ahead for us because I love the way, Cole, you see things and make it positive for our industry, and I love that. So let's keep on going, caring about people, caring about the building. I think it's just hard for us because we walk into buildings when we're doing the sampling. And so it's hard when we don't, who else is doing the sampling? What is the risk? It's usually us telling people there is a risk and they don't know. So interesting times ahead. So
Yeah, look,
should be
I think
interesting.
going through all that information, we're already doing most of that.
Yeah.
I guess the big issue is when you're doing larger commercial jobs, understanding that swims are involved, understanding where the remediator comes into it is important. I think for us, that's what's been missing, I think, in the course developing it over the last 15 years. So in the post-remediation course, the IEP course, really getting a lot more detail on what the S500 is actually saying, what the S520 is, so what best practice. So Sam and I've engaged Sam to create really complex, detailed information on the mould remediation process step by step, what the remediator needs to do, what their documentation looks like, because we should know what that is, what our documentation is as IEPs, and what we should expect from a remediator who has a duty of care, not just for the Australian standards, but also for the work health and safety legislation. So we'll be focusing a lot more on that. For those who've already done the PRV course, I'll be doing upgrading specifically with those groups to ensure that they now have all the templates and everything they need to be able to, really have a solid foundation here. Yeah.
Exciting times ahead. That's awesome, Cole. And always with OH&S, all the building biologists on here, remember when we're on site to wear the proper masks, eye protection, skin protection. I'll hand up, I've been to times before into houses where we don't know how bad it is, but everyone, I think that's one of our things is to protect ourselves too. Because I think sometimes we forget that, to protect ourselves. And I think that's another thing for PPE. And if anyone's got good mask recommendations and things for the rest of the practitioners, comfortable masks that don't fog up, things like that, weird shaped faces, like apparently I've got. If we've got good masks, I think that's, really, really helpful, because I think that we are showing people we do need to protect ourselves, because if we've been on sites with remediators and builders and things, who's wearing the mask? Number one. So are we taking it seriously in the first place? So.
And another part of the risk management and the hierarchy of control would be, asking the client, do you have an air purifier? So after I leave testing your house, I would recommend you have that air purifier in that room where you lifted the carpet on turbo for an hour to reduce your risk.
Yep.
So you're taking that into consideration as part of your risk management.
Yeah. Legends, everyone. Well done. I know that's what we care about, and now we've got this to go by as well. So looking forward to seeing more, Cole, and interesting times ahead.
Pity we have
Thank
to wait
you
a
so
month.
much.
Well, we can have it sooner, but I'm sure I don't know if anyone wants another. Well, I can show it
We'll do it next month. No, that's good. It's fantastic.
It's an hour and a half, the next one, so just be mindful it's a bit longer.
Bring the cup of tea, everyone. Herbal tea. All right. Thank you all for joining us for the June ASBB mentorship. Looking forward to next month, where we will be talking about this again, part 2. Thank you. Thanks, Cole,
Thank you.
as always.
Thanks, Cole.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.